2020. I'm Robert Atkinson of Mirae Asset Securities Prime Brokerage, the moderator. We are very pleased to welcome back author and columnist Gordon Chang to the roundtable. As many of you recall, he spoke here 2 years ago alongside Dr. Carl Weinberg of High Frequency Economics regarding why the U.S. investors cannot afford to ignore China. Today, Gordon will address a very timely topic, the impact that the coronavirus pandemic on China and how that could affect global supply chains, et cetera. By way of introduction, Gordon is one of the leading geopolitical analysts in the United States. He is widely known for his books, The Coming Collapse of China and Nuclear Showdown, North Korea Takes on the World. Gordon is also a columnist for the Daily Beast and a frequent contributor to publications including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the National Interest. In addition, he is a frequent commentator for Fox News and Bloomberg, among others. Before we begin, though, I do want to thank our sponsors for their ongoing support of the Roundtable and this WebEx in particular. They include Alston & Bird, Baker Tilly, Bloomberg, Deloitte, Grant Thornton, New Mountain Capital, and our nonprofit sponsors, Kaya, the United Kingdom Department of Trade, and the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg Trade and Investment Office. Just a reminder to everyone, Gordon will be answering my questions for about 45 minutes and making comments, and then we'll open it up to the audience. However, at any time during the WebEx, you are able to send questions into Gordon by using the tools at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, so I would encourage you to do so. One other programming note. The Roundtable's April Forum, the April Forum, will be done via WebEx with details to follow. Given the current state of affairs, we felt that it was important to safeguard everyone, and we're going to change the format to a WebEx. So by all means, keep an eye on the website, and we'll also be in touch. So Gordon, when we began talking to you, I guess about 3.5 weeks ago, one of the concerns we had at the Roundtable was if we didn't book you soon enough, by the time we did, the effects of the virus may largely be behind us. And we thought the March 12th date actually might be too far into the future. So obviously we got that wrong. This morning I read a piece by Scott Menard of Guggenheim entitled The Butterfly Effect, and in that piece he quoted Winston Churchill, and I quote, "This is not the end, it is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning," end of quote. So I suppose in many ways this is true for a lot of things related to this crisis, but it may be especially relevant to your comments about China and the supply chain. So just a few maybe interesting facts to set the table about China's role in the world economy. China accounts for, about 1/3 of global manufacturing output. It's the largest exporter since 2009, the world's largest trading nation since 2013. We've noted recently that their producer manufacturing index has plummeted well into the contraction zone since the beginning of the crisis. We also know that they have a lock on strategic goods such as rare earths production, rare earths metals, which are critical to military and defense military and technology products. And I've read recently where upwards of 80% of the medicines consumed in the United States are produced in China. That's amazing. So Gordon, let me ask you this. If as it has, China's manufacturing falls off a cliff, what's going to happen to the global supply chain?
Well, there's certainly going to be disruptions, Robert, and we've already seen some of them. You know, when we talk about pharmaceuticals and protective gear, there's been concern in the United States about our reliance on China, as you point out. And Rosemary Gibson has written about this for years. She's been yelling and screaming, and very much, we've ignored her. But, we've seen some very troubling developments. So, for instance, Maria Bartiromo, about a week and a half ago, 2 weeks, was mentioning on air that she was talking to the leaders of New York hospitals who had purchased from China protective gear, masks, gowns, gloves, and those goods were actually on the water, and China ordered those ships to turn around. Peter Navarro, who is the president's trade advisor, mentioned that a U.S. factory producing protective gear has been nationalized. So there is going to be some change going forward after this crisis is over, because it's obvious we cannot rely on China. And indeed, just a few hours ago, Global Times, which is a tabloid controlled by the Communist Party, threatened to cut off the sale of medical protective gear to the U.S. So there is growing concern, and this concern, I think, will have consequences after the epidemic is over. If you're talking about shoes and toys, China will continue to manufacture these. If you talk to the big box retailers these days, they're still sticking with China.
So Gordon, if what you say is true, why has this not been reported, not covered in the media? Why did the president not discuss this last night?
Well,
what are your thoughts?
I don't know what's in the president's mind about some of these issues. I think that he probably wants to keep the U.S. focused on the matters at hand. And what we've just been discussing are long-term concerns, which will be solved only in the long term. As for why we didn't pay attention to this, this is just a feeling that we lived in a globalized world. Supply chains would continue on. There wouldn't be disruptions that would have significance. And so, therefore, people just did not believe that this to be a problem.
Wouldn't you also say, Gordon, that admitting countries into the WTO, there are rules that they must play by? And isn't it not a rule that if you're a participant, a member of the convention, you have to have free trade?
Yes. Well, the problem here, though, is that China doesn't actually believe in honoring treaties, and their WTO violations have been significant, and for various reasons they've been continuing. But, the problem, Robert, is not so much a violation here or there of its WTO obligations. The real problem is that China, at least communist China, does not believe in the notion of comparative advantage, which is the underpinning for this whole idea of international commerce. And so if you have a country that believes in predatory trade and for various reasons has been able to get away with it, you've got a perfect situation for a disaster coming down the road. And I think that because the WTO does not have expulsion provisions, there's very little that we can do except for perhaps walking away from the WTO. And that is something that the Trump administration seems to be doing through its various actions. And it also has a fair amount of support in the American public for that. So we are going to either have a reformed WTO or perhaps no World Trade Organization whatsoever.
So I know before the United States was a participant in GATT. Well, the predecessor to WTO, of course, is GATT. And before GATT, there were regional trade arrangements. And it sounds like, or it seems like the Trump administration tends to favor these bilateral arrangements. Would you agree that that might be in the future for us?
Well, that's certainly the case. And the Trump administration has been explicit about its favoring bilateral trade deals, multinational ones. One of the first things the president did after taking office was to withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And that was an indication of how they felt about these big trade deals. Since then, there's been negotiation of trade deals with South Korea, which was actually implemented. We've got discussions with Japan. The USMCA with Mexico and Canada will soon become a reality. There's trade negotiations with the UK, the post-Brexit UK. So that's going to be the way things are going to go. And people have rightly complained that a spaghetti bowl, the term that has been used, is not as good as a World Trade Organization with rules that span the globe. And I agree with that. But the problem is that we have had a situation where this notion of international commerce according to international rules has been broken. And clearly China has had a large role in delegitimizing global trade rules.
So just as a follow-up to that, you talked a moment ago about pharmaceuticals and about medical supplies. If I'm not mistaken, those industries, or the industries that support them, are fairly capital intensive. You just can't throw a switch and suddenly start manufacturing that kind of gear, that kind of medicine someplace. You talked about disruption. So how do you see this disruption unfolding? So, for example, and before we went live, I think part of our dialogue included talking about the number of potential victims of this virus. It could go into hundreds of thousands, if not millions. Do we have the capacity to support those people? Do we test them? Do we even have the capacity to test them?
No, and it's obvious that we don't, because we can see what's happening today. The U.S. testing regime is seriously deficient. You had Dr. Fauci just a couple days ago, or just a few hours ago, talking about how the U.S. is not in a position to test. And so there is going to be a national conversation about that at some point. But clearly the U.S. public health infrastructure is not where it has to be, and there are going to be consequences for that. And you're right, you just can't move a pharmaceutical factory out of China. But nonetheless, we are going to have to do that. And we're going to have to do that for a whole host of reasons, some of them related to the coronavirus epidemic, some of them not. But as a nation, we are going to have to be making things that are critical to our people within our borders. And I think that's way the rest of the world is going to be moving as well.
Well, that's all well and good in theory, but in reality, to go back to a concept you introduced, comparative advantage, not all nations have the factors of production in order to support their needs, right? So the United States has been blessed with the ability to more or less be self-sustaining, right? We are the largest producer of energy, hydrocarbons. We produce food. We grow food. We have intellectual and financial capital that's still unrivaled. So the transition for this country might be easier than it is for other countries. So how will the rest of the world work then if I mean?
Well, the rest of the world isn't, and we, in addition to the rest of the world, are not going to be as efficient as we were in the globalization period, up until a couple months ago. But the model of an interdependent world is certainly breaking down. Robert, we live in an advanced society. It is specialized and complex. And specialized and complex societies are well designed and well able to meet crises. But they're also highly interdependent. They're interdependent internally and externally. And that means when they are overstressed, they are more vulnerable than other types of societies. And that's the problem that we face. I think when people in the United States are now faced with the prospect of a failed society, I'm not saying that's going to occur, but I'm saying it is possible, because we're talking about infections that could be in the tens of millions. One virologist said 96 million a couple days ago. Some people say more than that. And the point is, when you have a society which can break down, then the question is, what is the answer to it? And the answer is going to be self-sufficient, to not depend on China for certain items that are critically needed. And we, I think, as a society, are going to make the decisions to do certain things within our borders. That is not going to be as efficient. It's not going to be as good. There's going to be less innovation. But nonetheless, self-sufficiency is going to be considered a much more important objective for us, and we are going to move in that direction. How far we move, we don't know. But I don't think that after the coronavirus episode is over that we're all going to go back to where we were before, because I think too much has changed, and we have seen too much of the downside to return to the way we were 3 or 4 months ago.
So given the state of affairs between, as you represent them to be, between the United States and China, what happens in the meantime with lithium, graphite, nickel, cobalt, manganese, molybdenum, we don't mine these, or we don't mine them in quantities great enough to meet our demand. These elements are necessary for any type of technological good. What do we do about that?
I think that we've got to worry about China for many things, but for them to put a boycott on rare earths to the United States is probably not one of the things we have to be overly concerned with. We got to remember that the Japanese were the target of a Chinese boycott on rare earths. It was something around 2010 or so.
Yes.
And this was over a territorial dispute over islands in the East China Sea. And it was over a dispute between between a Chinese and a Japanese vessel that rammed each other, or the Chinese rammed the Japanese. And so Beijing put a boycott of rare earths to Japan. And that seemed to be a critical matter, but it didn't really work out that way. And it didn't work out that way for a couple of reasons. One of them is that Chinese producers of rare earths sold to the Japanese anyway. And so the Japanese were getting all that they needed. Also, Japan understood that they needed to find alternatives to rare earths, and they went on an innovation drive. So there's a lot of ways around this. China is not the sole location of rare earths. We've got a lot of them in this country. The reason why China has a near monopoly on manufacturing is because they have not enforced, and they don't have many environmental protections. If we as a nation decide that it is important to mine rare earths here, we will find a way to do it. And our allies, of course, like Australia, have rare earths. They're around the world. This is a group of metals that are on the same line on the periodic chart. It's not necessarily that they are rare. We can do it. Now, will there be disruptions? Yes, of course there will be. But at some point, we are going to have to make a decision about this because we cannot maintain our critical reliance on a China which is moving in extremely troubling directions.
You know, I think you're right about rare earths. They're really not rare. They're all over the place. The issue is getting access to them, and unfortunately, it takes anywhere from 5 to 8 to 10 years to bring a mine on production. It's not that easy, right? It's a capital-intensive undertaking, requires permitting, identifying the source of the ore
right.
bodies, and so on and so forth. So it's not as if we're going to be able to throw a switch with this. But
no.
hopefully, as you said, the Chinese react the way they did during that small crisis over those islands about 8 or 9 years ago, and they continue to supply them.
Yes. Well, you know, you're obviously right. It takes years and years and years to bring a mine into operation, as we saw with the mine in California. But, you know, there's also something called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977. And President Trump, with the flip of a switch, can make it a national priority to open mines and do whatever. And he can do pretty much whatever he wants pursuant to that legislation. I'm not saying that he will do that, but I'm saying that when the United States has to do something, we can do it. We saw mass mobilization during World War II. We can do this again.
Yes. And just to stay on the topic of rare earths, and to tie it into something else, another point that you made. Yes, rare earth elements are not, in fact, rare, but they're subject to the whims of the marketplace. And as I understand it, back in the 90s, we went through a drought with respect to demand, and many of the mines shut down in the United States, and the Chinese kept their mines open. So given this new world that you seem to think we're headed toward, do you see governments playing a larger role in supporting businesses through the business cycle?
Well, I think that's certainly going to happen. We got a hint of that last night with President Trump's address about emergency measures to support smaller businesses and businesses in general. This is something that we're probably going to see a lot of, actually, because this virus could be worse than many people think. So that's there. As a conservative, I don't like this. I don't like government and business, but I do believe that there are emergency situations. And I do believe that most Americans would get on board for something like that if there were a need. You know, we Americans are very, very good at ignoring threats until someone strikes us. And then we are very, very good at, when it's too late, to mobilize. So that's our model, and unfortunately we need to change to this. We need to start thinking about these things before they become problems. Now when you do that, of course, people say, oh, that's not a problem, you know, we don't need to do that. But at some point, I think that we are going to see the necessity of more robust action on the part of the government and more tolerance for the President using his emergency economic powers to accomplish certain objectives.
And do you have any industries or sectors in mind in particular that might be the beneficiary of this disruption?
Well, I don't know if anyone, I mean, in terms of disruption, I don't think you can say anyone's really a beneficiary. I think that you can see, though, that there will be certain economic sectors that will be identified as being crucial to national security. And they will receive, you know, unofficial pressure from the White House for industry to do certain things. And we may even see the use of emergency powers, which the President has. So, for instance, you identified the one which comes to mind at first, which is pharmaceuticals. There are a lot of reasons why we should not have a near total dependence on China for certain pharmaceuticals. So I think that that issue is going to be addressed. There's also issues regarding manufacture of critical electronic components for telecommunications and for others. You know, right now, for instance, if you buy a drone, in all likelihood it comes from China. That drone will send whatever it sees to the cloud, which means that China is right now mapping good portions of the world, including the United States. Probably we're going to see some sort of ban on Chinese drones. I mean, I'm not speaking for the administration. I haven't talked to them about this, but I would think that this is something that is in the cards, largely because this is extremely dangerous, and we've allowed this to occur for a very long time, and we are allowing a hostile state to surveil us. And I don't think that that is going to be acceptable. The same thing, of course, are surveillance cameras, which are made in China. You go through the list of electronic items that Beijing could use in the first hours of a war against us to paralyze our critical infrastructure. I just don't think the American people will accept continuing along that lines once the danger is pointed out. And by the way, the Chinese are doing a very good job in bringing this to our attention because, as I said, the Global Times just a few hours ago threatened to cut off medical protective equipment. And they did that, Robert, not because they were generally angry with us, because they were angry with the United States over its attempt to deal with Huawei's violation of U.S. laws. So here we have an attempt to extort the U.S. so that we do not enforce our laws. I mean, that's just completely unacceptable.
So let's talk about Huawei for a second. What is it that they did that we find so egregious?
They have used their equipment to surveil other countries. We know this because for 5 years, from 2012 to 2017, China surreptitiously downloaded data from the headquarters of the African Union in Addis Ababa. This was a building donated by the Chinese, and of course they used Huawei servers. And it was through the Huawei servers that China was stealing that data. We know that Huawei has stolen critical U.S. technology from Cisco Systems and from others. It continues to try to steal U.S. technology. And we know that the Justice Department has filed an indictment against its chief financial officer, Meng Wanzhou, the woman who is now subject to extradition proceedings in Vancouver.
She's in Canada, right?
So The reason why Huawei is important is because, first of all, we're moving to 5G, the 5th generation of wireless communication. 5G has speeds 2,000 times faster than existing 4G networks. So that means that devices around the world will be connected to each other, they'll be linked, and they will be communicating, which means that your front door, your pacemaker, your car, your toaster are going to be connected to the IoT, as they call it. And whoever controls those 5G networks will be able to do two things. One of them is to filch data, and that's important because that data will be fed into China's artificial intelligence systems. And second of all, they very well may be able to manipulate devices, which means they unlock your front door, drive your car off the cliff, stop your pacemaker or speed it up, depending on how malicious they are. Or they could take your toast and turn it to fire, you know. So this is going to be absolutely critical. 5G is in many ways the key to the future, and the United States cannot allow Huawei to do this. One other point. Huawei says it would never spy. Well, the news is that China has a national intelligence law enacted in 2017. It requires every Chinese individual, every Chinese national, and every Chinese entity to spy if demanded by Beijing. So when Huawei tells us they would never spy, that is just not to be believed. And also, it's just China's communist system. No one can resist a demand from the Communist Party. We know that China's been spying in the U.S., has had the most extensive and successful intelligence gathering network in history against the U.S., so when Huawei says it won't spy, we have to assume that it would, and that's why it is a national security threat to us.
How do you see this being resolved?
Huawei?
Yeah. And what's the answer? I mean, Huawei seems to have a corner on the latest and greatest technology.
Well, they do have, there's only 3 companies that provide a total 5G solution. There's Huawei and Ericsson and Nokia.
Yes.
And none of those are American, by the way.
Yeah.
But, you know, I think that this is one of those problems that will solve themselves because these 3 companies have proprietary systems. They're called stacked. In other words, you can't take an Ericsson server and put it into a Huawei system. Because the software and the hardware won't communicate with each other. But I think that we're going to see 5G, like the computer industry in the 1980s, move to open architecture, which means that you can, as they say, plug and play. This will become Lego, but for telecommunications. And that is probably the way the system is going to go, the world's going to go. And the reason is that it will be cheaper when you can plug and play. And, of course, there'll be more innovation. We saw this with computers. So I think that Huawei's dominance right now in 5G it certainly exists, but I don't think it is sustainable because the industry is going to move in ways which are going to open up the architecture, moving away from the proprietary systems of those 3 telecom providers.
So what does this mean for a company like Apple, do you think?
Well, Apple's got its own problems. Apple, I think, as we can see from the performance of its stock today, is in trouble for a number of reasons because it does have a closed system. But it's been very successful with that. Apple's problem is that it's got a reliance, almost a total reliance on China for manufacturing, and this is going to have consequences. And the other thing that troubles me about Apple is not that it's solely reliable, almost solely reliable on Foxconn, the contract manufacturer, and Foxconn is almost solely reliable on China. I think that to a certain extent, the Apple management has been oblivious to what's been going on. If you go back to January of this year, they gave their revenue guidance for that quarter. And then it was only 3 weeks later that they came back and said, oops, we're going to miss it. And we're going to miss it because we're going to have problems getting product out of China. Well, how could they miss revenue guidance after only 3 weeks? I think that Apple is totally committed to China. It's going to suffer for it. And if I were an Apple shareholder, I'd be pissed as hell because there's been this over-reliance on one country, and that one country could end up in a way that they won't supply products to Apple. I'm not saying, again, it's going to happen, but I'm saying this is a real possibility given the hostile nature of the Chinese regime towards the U.S., that you have to say, look, we can't rule out any scenario. Some scenarios are more probable than others. Probably things will be okay, but there's a substantial chance they won't be okay. And as I said before, in general, we are going to a very different relationship with the rest of the world, and that includes, of course, China.
So this almost brings us to full circle with your appearance 2 years ago. At that time, you spoke about China's plans for 2025 to dominate high-tech fields like pharmaceuticals, automotive, aerospace, semiconductors, IT, and robotics. How does that initiative look now? And what type of a threat is it to the United States and to the West in particular?
That's a really important question. You know, China right now doesn't look that good. And I think that, you know, certainly in February, its economy was contracting, deep in the red, and that's obvious from any number of indicators. We don't know about this particular month. We don't know how long it will take for China to climb back out. And then the question is, do they regain their position that they once had as the world's factory floor? And will they be able to maintain that image that they'll dominate the world in the 21st century? I tend to think that they won't be able to do it. And I think that it's largely because China has shown itself to be an unreliable member of global supply chains. It's shown in just an inherent hostility towards the United States, which could have consequences. I think it does change the nature of the American response to China. Now, it's entirely possible that we get a president who takes office next January who just says, oh, you know, China's not competition for us. But I do believe that we are seeing a change in the American political establishment, both parties, at least in the establishment wings of both parties, that indicates that they will change China policy. The Chinese, you know, I have no confidence in American political leaders, but I do have every confidence that the Chinese are so belligerent, so hostile, that they will leave us very little choice as to how we respond to their challenge.
Well, given the current state of affairs of the Chinese economy and the crisis that the world and China in particular is in the midst of, do you see any fallout for Xi Jinping?
You would think so. I mean, Xi Jinping has done a couple of things. Before he became General Secretary of the Communist Party, his most important post, and that was November 2012, China had more or less a collective system, which meant that everybody at the top had to sign off on policies, which meant that everybody got credit and everybody got blame. Nobody really was blamed, even for a big debacle, because everyone had agreed to it. Under Xi Jinping, he has moved to essentially a one-man system. And in that one-man system, he gets all the credit and got all the credit for China's terrific 2017, for instance. But I think that since he's the author of China's response to the coronavirus, he's the author of their Hong Kong policies, he is being blamed for the trade war, quote unquote, with the U.S., I must believe that he's been weakened. Now, the other side of that, and it's a very opaque system, so it's hard to speak with certainty about what's going on. On the other side of that, his policies have been so detrimental to China that it's actually helped him. And the reason is that I think that Chinese leaders right now are thinking that their system is at risk, they could lose it all, and so they've got to basically support Xi Jinping in order to get through a crisis. The real issue is what happens when this crisis passes, and you know, then the recriminations start, because you have Chinese people demanding fundamental political change. We've seen that from China's social media platforms. And we have Xi Jinping. We know he's had a lot of adversaries. Whether, you know, all of this has consequence after that time, I would assume so. But, you know, at this particular time, we don't know. One other point. Deng Xiaoping, who was Mao Zedong's successor, Mao Zedong, founder of the People's Republic, Deng Xiaoping started China on what we call the reform era. Deng, in the political arena, created these norms, guidelines, rules to constrain infighting at the top of the Communist Party, because in the Maoist era, there were no rules, and Deng was worried about the party tearing itself apart. As Xi Jinping went about accumulating power, he got rid of these norms, guidelines, rules, which means there's nothing to protect him on the downside, which means that the infighting at the top of the Communist Party could be brutal. It could go back to what it was like in Maoist eras. So at this particular time, we can't rule out any sort of scenario about what happens to China. And I actually tend to think, and I could very well be wrong on this, but I tend to think that the system is a lot less stable than it currently appears.
Well, apparently he was not seen in public or heard of, I believe, for 30 days during the beginning of the crisis. Do you have any information on that?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. He was not visible in public, and then eventually he emerged. We don't know what happened during that period, but we know that that must have been a time of turmoil, because that was when the Communist Party was figuring out what to do. Now, Mao Zedong, who is Xi's hero, Mao used to do this as well. When Mao got in trouble, he would disappear from public view. He would concentrate on consolidating his position. Then he'd come out and he would slash and burn his enemies. We haven't seen the slash and burn part of it, but maybe Xi Jinping was doing the same thing during that roughly 1-month period where he did disappear from public view. So we don't know, and we will only know later on, if ever, about what's happened during that crucial period. But we can sort of assume that the infighting at the top of the party was probably intense.
Okay. So Gordon, I want to propose an alternative universe to you, and I'd like to get your reaction to it. Given everything you've just said, or much of what you've just said about the animosity between the two countries, and the U.S. or the likelihood that countries will look to be less interdependent, and of course the U.S. seems to be, again, listening to the president last night, talking in terms of America first. Could one foresee a future where the United States continues to look more inwardly, but countries like China, which need other countries maybe more than the U.S. do, continue to build relationships around the world to the exclusion of the United States?
That's entirely possible, and that's what Beijing has been trying to do. Got to remember, though, that there are a couple of limitations on how far Xi Jinping can extend Chinese influence. Xi Jinping has been hinting, and his language has become more explicit as time has gone on. He's been hinting that China is the world's only sovereign state. So what he is saying, essentially, is that the United States, France, Germany, Burkina Faso are subjects to China. That's a concept that is not really going to play very well ultimately, because there's a limitation. His ambitions are really broad, and so when he talks about changing the international system, he talks about essentially all people under heaven are one family.
Yeah, the Middle Kingdom concept in 2025.
Yeah, that everybody is subject. Everybody has to acknowledge, no matter whether they're near or far to China, they've got to acknowledge Chinese rule. I mean, this is completely unacceptable to Americans, and it's unacceptable to everybody else. Also, Xi Jinping has been promoting Han nationalism, which is essentially racism. And we see that with his attempt to liquidate Uyghur culture in the northwestern part of the country. But we also see Chinese themes, racist themes that they promote during their propaganda blasts. And that is going to have a limitation on how far they can progress, especially in Africa. They've made great inroads in Africa, but they may be reaching high water point because essentially Africans are not very happy with being treated as less than human. And that is some of the themes that you see in Chinese propaganda, that people of black color are basically primates. So that's not going to play very well either. And it shouldn't play well with white people, because really what the logical conclusion of what Xi Jinping is promoting means the subjugation of everyone to people of the yellow race. And that is, of course, unacceptable to us. Now, Xi Jinping can't enforce these views. He can't compel others to accept them. He may be able to make some inroads because he's had a strong economy. But if the Chinese economy doesn't recover, I don't think you're going to find so much saluting in the direction of Beijing, and we are going to find a new assertive attitude around the world. So, Robert, while you're saying it's possible, but I don't think that it is likely.
Okay. So let me shift gears for a second and pose this question. Do you see any irony in the country that probably benefits the most from the international system, the country through whose aegis the system was set up, turning its back on the system? And I'm talking about the United States.
Right, of course. Yeah,
the United States, through its own efforts and those of its allies, created the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, the IMF, et cetera. It benefits us tremendously.
It certainly does. And there's no question about it, and it's total irony. But the problem is that some of these institutions that you've been talking about have been taken over by China. So, for instance, the World Health Organization, to take one that's pertinent. The WHO delayed declaring an emergency repeatedly. It was only yesterday that they declared there was a pandemic when it was clear that a pandemic existed last month. You know, we've allowed, as we've tried to integrate China into the international system, we've allowed China to extend its influence and to make many of these institutions unusable or detrimental to the international system. And what
Gordon, I was going to say, just to play devil's advocate, we said at the beginning, and I think you would agree with this, that a third of global manufacturing output emanates from China. They're the largest exporter in the world. They're the largest trading nation in the world. Traditionally, hasn't the country that met those requirements also been the home of the reserve currency? And aren't there special privileges that go along with being the home of the reserve currency? So do you see any, again, if you're looking at it from China's vantage point, China might be saying, gee, we do a lot of the heavy lifting, and we don't maybe get enough of the reward. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that, but I'm just curious to get your reaction to that, as to why they might want to rewrite the rules, so to speak.
Of course, China wants the renminbi to be the world's currency. And as you can tell, I worry a lot about China, but I don't worry at all about the renminbi replacing the greenback. And the reason is, if you have a reserve currency, if you want a reserve currency, you have to be freely convertible. And you've got to manage your currency so that you create confidence in others. And China doesn't do either of those things. Matter of fact, we have seen over the last several years, starting from the middle of, or starting from fall of 2016, we have seen China put more controls on its currency and put more controls on and influencing the value of the currency. So no one's, and if you look at the statistics on usage of the renminbi internationally, it actually hasn't gone up by very much over the last decade. You know, you're still in low single digits. And it's going to continue that way until Beijing opens up its capital account, opens up, you know, ditches its currency controls, and manages its currency for the benefit of the world. China doesn't do that.
Yes, so, and in many ways, China operates the same way the United States did for 50 to 75 years, looking out for its own, and it took us many years to learn the lessons of the United Kingdom and to be a reasonable financial steward, but it takes time.
It takes time, but also the U.S. had the benefit of being a democracy. China is a communist state, which is going back to totalitarianism. Xi Jinping is moving China away from the authoritarianism of the previous decades and returning the country to something that Mao would be almost familiar with the social credit system, the surveillance cameras, increased censorship. It's not exactly totalitarian, but it's not authoritarian. And so that's not a system that is going to be a good steward of the international financial system. So that is, I don't think, to be a concern. And I don't see China actually remaining the world's manufacturing base, and it's not going to be the world's biggest trading nation. So we have seen peak China, and we're going to see a very different world as countries react to what Beijing has been doing.
Very interesting. So Gordon, in our remaining time, let's swing back and talk about manufacturing for a second and about onshoring it here in the U.S. I've read that manufacturing jobs have changed, and that it's not the way it used to be. It's not your father's manufacturing job. That the typical job requires an associate's degree and training in engineering. Do we have the skilled and educated workforce to fill the demand if we were to bring manufacturing back here?
Not now. Clearly not now. And there's no question about that. But that's
Doesn't it take a generation to create that kind of talent at least?
I don't know if it takes as much as a generation, because you're talking 25 years, but it takes time. And right now we have, at least before the coronavirus episode, we had essentially full employment, and full employment with the structure of the economy that wasn't very conducive to manufacturing. But these things are going to change, and they're going to change because of political constraints. You've got to remember that globalization, all sorts of things, are the result of political decisions. They're the result of decisions to take down barriers to economic decision-making. But what we have seen is countries are now erecting barriers, and they're doing that because economics is taking a back seat. It's taking a back seat to national security concerns, as it should. At this particular time, we are going to a very different world, and one which I think most of us cannot imagine. We may not like the world. I won't like the world the way that it's going, but we're not being left by much choice right now, because this is not an American decision. This is very much being driven by China. Just to take something that you mentioned, Robert, you talked about America first. When I heard the president's inaugural speech, I hated it. I didn't like the America first language. But as Xi Jinping has been talking about China as being the world's only sovereign state, I recognize that sovereignty, which is something that President Trump used in his inaugural address, sovereignty is increasingly important. And this is not being driven by Trump. Trump is a reaction to what's occurring in the world. And until those things that are occurring in the world change, we are going to have the U.S. move in the direction that Trump has been talking about, largely because, as I said, this is not a U.S. – we're not driving the world anymore. The Chinese are, and they're driving in a direction that we don't like, but we're going to have to respond to it.
Very interesting. You know, I'm reminded when you talk about self-sufficiency, I'm reminded of my readings of World War I. And I think one of the main reasons Imperial Germany was defeated was it wasn't so much defeated on the battlefield as it was they ran out of oil and they ran out of food. They had become very much integrated into the global trading system that had been put in place by their principal adversary, the United Kingdom. And I think that's what brought them to their knees ultimately, because they were on foreign soil when they surrendered. And I wonder, are we seeing a major turning in the tide, so to speak? Will the pendulum swing back away from globalism to something more almost mercantilistic in nature?
Well, we're already seeing that, Robert. I mean, and it's not just Trump. I mean, we saw Brexit, for instance, the rise of populism across Europe, a real questioning of the European Union, and probably that will be something that will continue. And, you know, part of it is because you do have elites in countries who have seen that they have more in common with elites in other countries than they do with people in their backyard, and that can go on for a little while, but there are a lot of people in the backyard who aren't very happy with what's going on, and so the notion of international commerce, international exchanges, and the rest of it, it won't go away, of course, but it will be de-emphasized. We will go back to understanding sufficiency is more important, and part of it is because the world geopolitically is cleaving. I mean, you referred to that earlier. You've got China and Russia working very closely together. China has allies, Iran and North Korea. They feel emboldened. They are doing things which are unacceptable, destructive to world order, and the West has reacted very slowly to this, but we will have to react. And I don't know what will be the trigger of it, whether it'll be this virus or not, but that is the general direction we're moving. I don't think we're going to move there in a straight line, but we are going to go there, and it will be a difficult transition because we won't live in such a prosperous world, but at least it'll be a safer world. Remember, we have this virus because it emanated from China. China pressured a lot of countries to keep their borders open to China. It spread to places like South Korea and Italy, and it's spreading here. And the only reason why we don't have an emergency situation right now, the reason why we are not crippled, is because President Trump on January 31st imposed the quarantines and travel restrictions on China. He should have probably imposed restrictions on South Korea and Italy a lot earlier. And now we have a Europe which is very much on its back. We're going to have to close our borders if we're going to protect the health of Americans. That's not something we want to do. But if we don't do that, we are going to look like a South Korea, South Korea and Italy, or a China. And by the way, Angela Merkel said that she expects, or that 70% of Germans could be infected with the coronavirus. That's completely unacceptable. But there are American virologists who are saying that's a real possibility here in terms of percentage. So we're going to have to do things that many people, including me, don't like, but which I think are becoming absolutely necessary. We're probably going to have to close our borders. They're going to have to be sealed shut for a little while. We have to let this virus go away, and then we have to figure out what to do in the future about future diseases.
Well, that's an extraordinary number. To go back to Merkel's comment, 70% of the German population. If it's a double-digit number in a country like the United States, that's extraordinary. And how would we support that?
Right. I mean, the reason why people died in Wuhan and was, of course, because of the coronavirus, but it was more because the health system was overwhelmed at a very short period. Just couldn't deal with it, so people started dying in the streets. We have a health infrastructure that needs to have been much better than it was, and we are going to have recrimination in our country about how we let this system go into disrepair. But the point is, our system can be overwhelmed. And as I said, we're a complex, advanced, specialized, interdependent society. When we get past that tipping point, we will be in much worse shape than basic societies. So we've got to remember that we too can be overwhelmed. And although I don't like the idea of a travel ban on Europe, I do think it's absolutely necessary, and it should have been done earlier.
Okay. So I just want to remind the room, if there are any questions, more than happy to answer them in our remaining moments. Gordon, do you see the emergence of regional trade organizations?
It's already happening, Robert. I mean, what is USMCA? I mean, of course, it's just the extension of NAFTA, but I think it's moving in that direction. China's trying to do it in its own region with RCEP, the Regional Economic Closer Partnership, or whatever it is. So, yeah, and what is the European Union? So, yes, that's
quite fractured now, isn't it?
Well, yes, it was broken a few months ago. And it probably will be broken up a little bit more. But I do think that we are going to see much more trading at home to shorten, if nothing else, Robert, to shorten supply lines, because we realize how critical that is. One thing we haven't mentioned, a lot of people are concerned about climate change, as am I. What causes climate change? Well, you have those container ships which produce more carbon dioxide than all the motor vehicles in the world. So if you want to improve the climate, one of the things you do is proximity manufacturing. You manufacture close to consumers. There's also some business reasons to do that as well. But I think we are going to see that as the climate movement gains strength, as it probably will, the point is you can't have international commerce and a clean environment. You got to choose between the two. And the question is, where do you go? And at least you talk about generational change. Among younger generations, they probably will move towards a cleaner environment.
So Gordon, I have another question from the audience here. Where do you see the opportunities once we get ahead of the virus? What sectors of the economy?
You know, as people have said, Netflix is looking pretty good these days because people are staying home. So I think you'll find a lot of that. You know, I don't do investment analysis, so my views are probably not to be taken well, but you can tell the sectors that are going to do well, like cruise lines, which, you know, some of those shares that today are down 25%. You know, the airlines. Yeah, well, I saw one down 25%, I forget. You know, the airlines. I came back on the red eye from Los Angeles a couple days ago. I actually got to lie down on 3 economy seats. That's unheard of.
That's right.
And United Airlines today is taking a beating, as you might expect, along with the other airlines. So I think that you will find one sector that will do very well is small business, manufacturing close to home, servicing communities. I think that that's going to do pretty well. Now, maybe it's hard to monetize that for the financial markets, but I think that's probably where we're going to go. Those who service small business probably will do very well. You know, business will change. There'll be all sorts of sectors of businesses that we don't think about now. So, you know, I sort of see us moving in that direction. But you can see what's not going to do well. And so I guess you can say the rest of it is going to do better because money's got to go somewhere.
Yes, this is true. So, Gordon, we're about out of time, and I want to thank you for your very insightful views on the coronavirus and global commerce. I'd also like everyone in the room to know that Gordon's Twitter handle is on the screen and that you should definitely be following Gordon on Twitter. I understand our president even follows Gordon on Twitter and has retweeted some of Gordon's tweets. So, Gordon, any closing comments, any thoughts?
Yeah, we're Americans, so we'll get through this. We'll eventually, you know, as Winston Churchill says, we'll do the right thing when we absolutely have to and not before. We are you know, we've got a great country. We're resilient. We're strong. And we will get through this, and we probably will end up on a relative basis stronger than we went going in. Because in downturns, they generally take down those economies where they're reliant on outside cash, like China, and economies like ours, which are can be independent, are going to do very well. So,
or single-trick ponies, countries that don't have a broad, that aren't broadly sustainable.
Yeah, we are a sustainable economy, and we can get on ourselves. We will do well. Welcome to the second American century.
Excellent. So Gordon Chang, again, on behalf of the New York Alternative Investment Roundtable, we want to thank you for your time and, again, for your insights. And, again, folks, just want to remind everyone that if you want to reach Gordon, his email is on the screen along with his Twitter handle. So until next month, and again, Gordon and Lydia Chang, thank you so much, and we'll speak with you soon.
Well, thank you, Robert. I really appreciated the opportunity.
It's always a pleasure, Gordon. Bye-bye now.